The Tenth Insight by James Redfield, Chapter 6 Review, A History of Awakening. This is a very profound chapter. If I had the rights to reproduce this material, I would just straight narrate this entire chapter. It's very hard to do a review of this chapter because so much of it should be included, and thus I've just omitted it and gave you the pages you should read on your own. The chapter makes mention of the Ascetics. These are members of a secret order of Franciscan spirituals who had been excommunicated after Pope Celestine V had resigned. Asceticism is a lifestyle characterized by abstinence from worldly pleasures, often for the purpose of pursuing spiritual goals. Ascetics may withdraw from the world for their practices or continue to be part of their society, but typically adopt a frugal lifestyle characterized by the renunciation of material possessions and physical pleasures, and time spent fasting while concentrating on the practice of religion or reflection upon spiritual matters. Pope Celestine V, late 13th century. The ruins in Peru from the first book, where the 9 insights were found, were named after him when first discovered in the 1600s. Pope Celestine V, who lived from 1215 to May 1296, was pope for 5 months from July 5th to December 13th, 1294, when he resigned. He was also a monk and hermit who founded the Order of the Celestines as a branch of the Benedictine order. Over the years, there has been much interest in why he really resigned after only 5 months. The Spirituals, a group of monks who believed that a higher awareness could be achieved by extracting themselves from human culture and returning to a contemplative life in nature. They were condemned as Gnostics and excommunicated. Gnostics. The Gnostics were early Christians who believed that followers of the one God should not merely revere Christ, but strive to emulate him in the spirit of Pentecost. They sought to describe this emulation in philosophical terms as a method of practice. As the early church formulated its canons, the Gnostics were eventually considered willful heretics, opposed to turning their lives over to God as a matter of faith. To become a true believer, the early church leaders concluded one had to forego understanding, analysis, and be content to live life through divine revelation, adhering to God's will moment by moment, but content to remain ignorant of his overall plan. The Gnostics accused the church hierarchy of tyranny and argued that their understandings and methods were intended to actually facilitate this act of letting go to God's will that the church was requiring, rather than giving up mere lip service to the idea, as the churchmen were doing. Eventually, all texts related to Gnosticism were deemed blasphemous and excluded from the Bible. And this goes to this idea of, I think the church wants you to believe that Jesus was a God that became a man, but there's groups and sects that believe that Jesus was a man that became a God. See how that reverse changes everything you believe about what you can achieve? And so the church wanted to suppress that angle and have you go with the original angle. And these Gnostics, I think, were looking to empower the human, and thus that was no good. Empowered humans are not as easily controlled. The Gnostic Dilemma, the fate of the Gnostics. The Gnostics lost and were banished from all church functions and texts, their beliefs disappearing underground among the various secret sects and orders. As long as the church held out the vision of a transformative spiritual connection with the divine, yet persecuted anyone who talked openly about the specifics of the experience, how one might actually attain such an awareness, what it felt like, then the kingdom within would remain merely an intellectualized concept within church doctrine, and the insights would be crushed anytime they surfaced. The church was afraid to come out and say that Christ modeled a way of life that each of us could aspire to, although that is what is clearly said in the scriptures. They feared that this position would give too much power to individuals, so they perpetuated the contradiction. On the one hand, the churchmen urged a believer to seek the mystical kingdom of God within, to intuit God's will, and to be filled with the Holy Spirit. But on the other hand, they condemned as blasphemous any discussion of how one might go about achieving these states, often resorting to outright murder to protect their power. And this is what I was saying on the previous slide. Sure, you want to be like God, but you can't actually be God. Don't you dare. Beware of forcing an understanding into culture before it's time. The main character learns where his ankle injury originated from, and it was from a past life. But if you think back again to my Question Reality episode 5, where I said that my quest, my life, my birth vision would be to bring a concept to awareness that will change the way humans observe reality or experience reality. And when I asked them, when I was in my crib and I asked, how come I'm in the year 1980 right now? And they said, you're placed in the optimum time in order to bring about the most amount of change, because so much change will be happening all at once that it's the prime time to be able to introduce new ideas. The Benedictine Order. The Benedictine Order comprises of monks living under the rule of Saint Benedict and commonly known as Black Monks. Cardinal Nicholas. Cardinal Nicholas was mentioned in the chapter. When I looked him up, all I could find was Nicholas of Cusa, and he was a German philosopher, theologian, jurist, and astronomer. One of the first German proponents of Renaissance humanism, he made spiritual and political contributions in European history. A notable example of this is his mystical or spiritual writings on learned ignorance, as well as his participation in power struggles between Rome and the German states of the Holy Roman Empire. And what I found of learned ignorance is that it means that since mankind cannot grasp the infinity of a deity through rational knowledge, the limits of science need to be passed by means of speculation. This mode of inquiry blurs the borders between science and ignorance. In other words, both reason and a super-rational understanding are needed to understand God. This leads to the union of opposites, a doctrine common in mystic beliefs from the Middle Ages. These ideas influenced other Renaissance scholars in Cusa's day, such as Pico della Mirandola. And this is kind of the theme in the Celestine prophecy, as well as Dan Brown's novels. And it's the merging of religion and science, but in this case also with the mystical and the paranormal. Because there are things that religion and science can't tell us. And in those situations, you need to look to magic. The Human Potential Movement. The emerging belief that human beings were presently actualizing only a small portion of their vast physical, psychological, and spiritual potential. I think the modern day version of this might be transhumanism, but I'm not sure. But I'm all for this. Advance mankind. Having a life review while still alive. Some 10th insight wisdom shared. We are discovering that our intuitions and our sense of destiny in our lives are remembrances of our birth visions. As we understand the 6th insight more fully, we're analyzing where we have been off track or failed to take advantage of opportunities so that we can immediately get back on a path more in line with why we came back to Earth or why we came here in the first place. We're bringing more of the process into consciousness on a day-to-day basis. In the past, we had to die to engage in a review of our lives, but now we can wake up earlier and eventually make death obsolete, as the 9th insight predicts. Humans came to the earth to systematically remember, to gradually awaken. We're becoming aware of a process that has been unconscious since human experience began. The way it is now, we perceive a birth vision and thereafter birth have gone unconscious, aware of only the vaguest of intuitions. In the early days of humans, the distance between what we intended and what we actually accomplished was very far, and then over time the distance has closed. Now we're on the verge of remembering everything. We can now look at history not as the bloody struggle of the human animal who selfishly learned to dominate nature and to survive in greater style, pulling himself from the life in the jungle to create a vast and complex civilization. Rather, we could look at human history as a spiritual process, as the deeper systematic effort of souls, generation after generation, life after life, struggling through the millennia toward one solitary goal: to remember what we already knew in the afterlife and to make this knowledge conscious on earth. The history of awakening is described on pages 114 to 133, so it's about 19 pages, is a great history told of, I'd say, Western civilization from beginning to present day. It's wonderful. It's very similar to the 2nd insight, and it's even self-aware of itself that it acknowledges the 2nd insight. The entirety of this section should be covered. It's 29 pages, so acquire the book and read this section. It is profound and will give you an interconnected view of history. It is very much like the Second Insight in the original Celestine Prophecy, and if you haven't read the Second Insight, you might want to get the original Celestine Prophecy book and read that as well, because in my Second Insight video, I didn't really cover it word for word. But both the Second Insight and Chapter 6, pages 114 to 133, it's great, especially if you're in school and you're in a history class, especially like a Western civilization class. I think I wound up turning this in. I think I combined the Second Insight and this chapter and turned it in for a grade, acknowledging that it was from Celestine and 10th Insight. I think I said that this more beautifully described what the essay test had. This section is described as a new spiritual interpretation of history, somewhat specific to the author's cultural view. Part of the 10th is a clear view of the human quest as seen in the afterlife. Everyone is born with a positive intention to bring more of the knowledge contained in the afterlife into the physical. It's important to ask questions like why. Ask why. Gain self-awareness. The anxiety of being alive without knowing why, that's the preoccupation that's spoken of in the Second Insight, and it's recovered again here. So the preoccupation was a vocabulary term from the first book, and that's the anxiety of being alive without knowing why, and that's what led to the Industrial Revolution and science. It was people taking their attention away from spirituality and bringing it upon the physical, empirical world. Again, that Second Insight helps you understand where the Western mind and why it came to be. Page 130, while recapping the original conservative revolution after the 60s, really sounds like the aftermath of the current presidential election. I really recommend reading page 130 and 131. It feels like it's a current event, even though this book came out in 1996. So it's like 21 years ago, and it's the same exact. You'd feel like it's being written about today. In fact, here, I'll read a little bit from it. In the face of this backlash, I could see the advocates of human potential moving into fear and defensiveness themselves, sensing that many hard-earned victories for individual rights and social compassion were now in danger of being swept away by a tide of conservatism. Many considered this reaction against liberation an attack by the embattled forces of greed and exploitation, who are pushing forth in one last attempt to dominate the weaker members of society. And again, I don't want to plagiarize too much of this, but unless you've been living under a rock, you've seen protests and people not satisfied with the outcome of this presidential election. And what I liked about this section was it showed that the fear is not just for one end of the political spectrum. It could be both the left and the right, attempting to maintain their control on culture and society. I always like objectivity, pointing the finger everywhere instead of just at one side. If you happen to be at a bookstore and you see 10th Insight, just read this chapter. If you were going to only read one, read this one. I think the rest of the chapters I could cover pretty good in this video series, but this chapter is just too much. Look, I'm already hitting the 14-minute mark, and I didn't cover any of these 29 pages. Meister Eckehart. The central theme of Eckhart's German sermons is the presence of God in the individual soul and the dignity of the soul of the just man. In later life, he was accused of heresy and tried as a heretic. He has acquired a status as a great mystic within contemporary popular spirituality. Now, I don't know if you're catching this common theme here, but this theme throughout all these individuals and groups that the author is presenting to us, these are all people that defied the church by saying that the power of God is within. We don't need you. We could have it. We could find the salvation ourselves. Just like I think Martin Luther, and that's what the Second Insight I was just saying to read, talks about how the great event of Western civilization is when Martin Luther stapled his complaints on the church door, which created the Reformation and the Lutheran Revolution. And that was the biggest moment. And all these characters that we're talking about here are like Luther in that they're challenging the church's order and power. and dominion over your life and giving liberation and an individual relationship between you and God. Tellhard De Chardin. Pierre Tellhard De Chardin was a French idealist, philosopher, and Jesuit priest who conceived the idea of the omega point, a maximum level of complexity and consciousness towards which he believed the universe was evolving, and developed Vladimir Vernadsky's concept of the noosphere. Noosphere is the sphere of human thought. I think we more commonly refer to it now as either the akasha, the collective conscious, the ether. And as I previously said, this chapter should be read. It's a 30-page chapter. 20 of it is dedicated to the history of awakening as far as the new spiritual understanding of history. Basically, what I covered was 10 pages of the periphery of the chapter. My reviews of all the books on this channel are to advance my agenda items and choosing. And so I'm trying to review the book, but I can't straight plagiarize, narrate it. I'm just taking the important parts out, but that 20 pages, that's really important, and you should read it. Obviously, all the books on this channel you should read in addition to my reviews. My reviews are just hopefully helping bring the material to life and pointing out the parts I think are important. But just know that my reviews of all the books on this channel are to advance my own agenda items, and those are choosing our lives in another dimension and exposing artificial scarcity, which I feel like this book and most of the titles that I select advance those awarenesses. You might find a deeper truth in these books specific to you, because I'm tailoring it towards what I think is important, but your truth is different than my truth, and your agenda and what you're trying to achieve is probably not the same as what I'm trying to achieve. So I'm just highlighting the parts that are consistent with my message, or in other cases, it's new information to me, and I'm trying to share that. I figure if I haven't seen it yet, chances are you probably haven't. The History of Awakening, Chapter 6, is a great chapter that should be experienced on your own. Even if I did narrate it, I couldn't tell the story to you because I feel like every person will experience it different. So that's it for Chapter 6, even though it's not it, but that's all I'm covering for Chapter 6. Again, I recommend you finding this chapter, reading it. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I hope you're starting to ask some questions and feeling empowered, and I'll see you next time.